and it's thought that people may have worshipped here long before Christian times. The church of St Andrews at nearby Titchbourne was also built on high ground overlooking the village. It dates from the Saxon period, and its original door is said to grant sanctuary to all who grasp its handle. Titchbourne village has many unusual tales to tell, and it's one of the few places where an operational telephone box sits in someone's garden. The village is perhaps most famous for the Titchbourne Dole, a ceremony that dates back to the Middle Ages, when the saintly Lady Mabella tried from her deathbed to aid the poor of the estate. Her husband, Sir Roger, was not a charitable man, and he offered her as much land for her cause as she could crawl around whilst carrying a burning brand. The determined Lady Mabella somehow managed to encompass 23 acres, much to the chagrin of her husband. Thus, the Titchbourne Dole was established on a yearly basis, and Lady Mabella laid a curse on the house should it ever be stopped. By 1794, the poor were flooding in from all over the country, and so the dole was stopped, but promptly reinstated when part of the house fell down, and so it's continued through to the present time. The river now flows north and soon joins the Arles tributary running from Alresford. Around 1200, the visionary Bishop of Winchester, Godfrey de Lucy, dammed the streams around Old Alresford to produce a head of water that made the Itchen navigable to this high point, providing a trade link with Winchester and Southampton. Silted to a fifth of its original size, Old Alresford Pond is now a wildfowl reserve behind the 17th century Globe public house. Across a 14th century causeway is New Alresford, which belies its name by dating back to the 12th century. Bishop de Lucy's far-sighted efforts later put Alresford on the map, and by the 1300s it had become one of the foremost wool markets in the country. Broad Street was the centre of activity, and it remains one of the most picturesque aspects to any village centre in England. When the wool trade declined, Alresford became something of a backwater, but later it had a new lease of life with watercress beds propagated along the river's banks. It was, however, the advent of the railway that provided the growers with rapid transportation to London. Most commonly known as the Watercress Line, passenger steam trains still run out of Alresford, travelling east through Ropley and then onto Alton. Meanwhile, the tributary of the Arles flows west out of Alresford to join the Itchen, and from this point on, it has traditionally provided some of the best chalk stream fishing available in the county. At Ovington, the river divides. The village itself is small, but the Bush Inn, built during the 17th century, is one of the most popular public houses in Hampshire. Ovington is one of a chain of Saxon settlements that ran along the river valley between here and Winchester. The main course of the Itchen supports various mills along its way, and for centuries they've derived power from the river's substantial flow. Itchen Stoke is a delightful village, a mixture of early timber frame buildings and thatched cottages of flint and brick. The Reverend Charles Conybeare built a church at his own expense, which was said to have been inspired by the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. The beautiful villages of Itchen Stoke and later Itchen Abbas grace its banks, their very existence inextricably entwined with the life on the river. It's said that Charles Kingsley often stayed at Itchen Abbas, and it was the crystal clear waters here that inspired him to write The Water Babies. In Hereward the Wake, he described the Itchen as so clear that none could see where water ended and air began. The church of St John the Baptist was rebuilt in the 19th century in Norman style to replace the original church of 1092. Rector Robert Wright tried unsuccessfully to win a reprieve for Gypsy John Hughes, the last man to be hanged at Winchester in 1825 for stealing a horse. Not far to the west lies Martyr Worthy, derived from the Saxon wordy, which means a place or hamlet. In 1285, the village was held by the prior and convent of St Swithun's, and the local church still bears the name. During the Middle Ages, most of the villages along the river here were important for sheep farming. Several worthies were mentioned in Anglo-Saxon charters. This is Abbotsworthy. The land of Worthy was granted to the church at Winchester in 908 by Edward the Elder, son of Alfred the Great. From Abbotsworthy, the river flows south and on through Winchester. There can be little doubt about the power once held here over the surrounding land by the bishops of Winchester. They had strict control over the local economy until Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries. When the monastic lands fell into the hands of others as manors, quite often as gifts from a grateful king, the local villagers probably danced to the same tune, but to a different master. Some 4 miles west of Basingstoke, the River Test rises from a field close to the village of Ash, a small farming community clustered around the local church. By the time the river has reached Quidhampton, the flow of water is enough to support a local mill. Portals have a mill nearby that's been making banknotes and security paper since the early 1920s. However, today's purpose-built complex lacks the picturesque quality of Quidhampton Mill. St Mary's Church at Overton is mentioned in Domesday. It was a church manor as far back as King Alfred's time. Overton is one of the so-called new towns laid out by Bishop de Lucy in a similar fashion to New Alresford. The main thoroughfare of Winchester Street was wide enough to hold an annual sheep fair. The Test is one of the most exclusive fishing rivers in the world and has been described as the queen of chalk streams. At Whitchurch, the river once supported 4 mills, all mentioned in Domesday, and the old silk mill, which has been restored, may stand on the site of one of them. Here it's possible to see silk production in progress, and this is the only silk mill still operating in Hampshire. With an earlier paper mill at Naverstoke making banknotes, prior to the one at Overton, there was a time when this stretch of river was busy with manufacturing industries. People have lived on the site of Whitchurch since Neolithic times. In the 16th century, this was one of the largest towns in Hampshire, and the old White Hart Inn was once a coaching stop for travellers between Salisbury and London. The Bourne joins the Test south of Whitchurch, but begins as a rivulet to the north, not far from the unspoilt hamlet of Ibthorpe. Jane Austen was a regular visitor here and stayed at nearby Ibthorpe House. Immediately south is the picturesque village of Hurstbourne Tarrant, originally a Saxon settlement and was once part of the extensive King's Forest. In 1266 it was granted to the Cistercian nunnery of Tarrant in Dorset, from which it gets its name. Most of the surrounding forest was cleared by the beginning of the 19th century to provide pasture and arable farmland. William Cobbett wrote that villagers here were amongst the poorest he'd come across in England. This area is often called the Hampshire Highlands, and along the slopes of the valley, the woodlands for which the area was once famous are still in evidence. The river continues on its journey through Stoke until it reaches the village of St Mary Bourne, famous for its watercress beds. The village was a pioneer of street lighting with oil lamps, and the last street lamp was restored to celebrate the Queen's Jubilee. The Norman church of St Peter's is built of flint and stone. It contains one of Hampshire's famous Tournai marble fonts, a distinction that, along with its grazing sheep, it has with East Meon. The church is set close to the village street and surrounded by thatched cottages is an impressive sight. The river, continuing south, passes through Hurstbourne Priors and soon joins the Test, which then flows on to Long Parish. Long Parish itself does not appear by name until the beginning of the 16th century, as from the 10th century until the dissolution it was in the manor of Middleton, which was in the possession of the Benedictine nunnery at Hurrell. The union of several districts into one along the main road makes Long Parish an appropriate name. The village has a long association with cricket that started as far back as 1878. The village team has reached the finals of the Village Cricket Championships on 2 occasions, and the team have had the honour of playing at Lord's. In 1987, they were rewarded for their efforts with a convincing win over a Yorkshire side in the final. The local church of St Nicholas is in the parish of Middleton. It's 13th century in origin and boasts a 16th century flint-checkered west tower. The stocks still stand in front of the church, and a grindstone has sat for many years by the side of the village road and is still used by local people. Hurrell, to the south, was the site chosen by Queen Elfrida, daughter of the Earl of Devon, to found a priory as penance for her misdeeds. The present church of St Peter and Holy Cross was built in 1858, not far from the original abbey site. The story is King Edgar sent a courtier to check on the fabled beauty of Elfrida. The courtier, Earl Athelwood, liking what he saw, married the lady himself. The deceit was discovered, and the king is said to have murdered Athelwood a few miles to the north in Harewood Forest. The lady then married the king and bore him a son, Ethelred. When the king died 15 years later, his son Edward, by a previous marriage, succeeded to the throne in 975. 4 years later, quite jealous of Edward, Elfrida was responsible for his death at Corfe Castle in Dorset. Her own son, Ethelred, came to the throne and proved to be a quite useless king. Hence his name, Ethelred the Unready. Troubled by her guilt, Ethelred's mother set up and entered her own nunnery here at Hurrell. To the east, on the opposite side of the river's many tributaries, lies the village of Chilbolton. During the Second World War, American paratroopers of the 2nd Airborne Division were stationed here. In December 1944, during terrible weather, they took off in gliders and crossed the Channel to France, where they took part in the Battle of the Bulge. Since then, US war veterans have returned to present the villagers with honorary membership to Montville in New Jersey. 8 miles to the east, a tributary called the Deva rises. It flows through Micheldever, a village that takes its name from the river. In the past, local villagers have primarily worked the surrounding farmland as well as watercress beds along the river, which are augmented by artesian boreholes. During the 1830s, riots broke out across the south of England and many workers were deported or imprisoned. 2, James Cooper of Fordingbridge and Henry Cook of Micheldever, were hanged. Cook for manhandling a member of the local Baring family. He was only 19 years of age and lies buried in the local churchyard. The Deva runs east through the villages of Stoke Charity and Wanston. The Norman church at Stoke Charity is one of the jewels of the Deva Valley, as it's remained virtually unchanged since 1250. The tributary of Pill Hill Brook runs into the Test from the opposite side to the Deva from the west. It passes through Monkston, a village with a number of fine thatched cottages. The village itself claims an extraordinary 18th century rector who became so obsessed with mathematics that he neglected just about everything else. The brook, increasing in size, flows on through the pretty villages of Abbottsan and Anna Valley. But before it has a chance to show itself to full advantage, it enters into the River Anton between Upper Clatford and Andover. The Church of All Saints at Upper Clatford dates from the early 1100s. For many generations, this was very much a farming community, although in present times, this is